Looking closely at the cambium, I can see a hairline crack across here. Now this is near the grip where I felt it was a bit stiff, and there's a ridge here, but obviously if I flex that, I don't know if you can see those cracks opening up, which just shows that there is movement there. So I might take that ridge down a little. A couple of cracks here as well, which just shows the whole limb is flexing. So yeah, I can even it up a little bit, but it's not a matter of I've got one really stiff point or anything like that. But there's a lot of wood to come off, so I'd better get on with it. I'm trying to take more off towards the fade, get more working limb. But as I'm working, I'm beginning to get some tear outs where there's swirl in the grain. Like here, I could feel it was in danger of digging in, so I'll stop there and take that off with the rasp now. That's my Farrier's rasp. That's very good for just flattening over sort of knotty areas. Of course, the belly of the bow doesn't want to be dead flat. It's got to follow some of the undulations that are present on the back. But like I say, for knotty areas, it'll stop it tearing. And how much you take the limb into the fade is one of those things. It's just a matter of feel and what you want. And some people have very long fades and great big long grips. I tend to keep the grip pretty short, so the heel of your hand even overlaps onto the lower limb slightly. That sort of effect's how I like it. Because the longer the working limb, the less stress it is. Leave it a bit thick there to allow for that nice chunky hole. I've tightened my tillering string one more turn. The bow looks to be over that side again, and the string line is well away from the centre. Why is it perpetually moving that way? Several answers. The obvious one is I can push the string over to this side a bit at either end, and that will help. So there, I've forced the string over to that side, and it's now sitting a bit more centrally. How does the bow want to come back? Now if we look at the angle of this limb, it's sort of an angle like that, so perhaps the string wants to come back this way. But conversely, because of this dip here, it dips at an angle. I don't know if you can see that. Does it want to come back this way or that way? So you hold it in your hand and you let the bow feel how it wants to pull back. Do we want to line it up with this limb or that limb? You haven't got a continuous flat surface that is your reference point. So to some extent you let the bow find its own reference point, its reference plane if you like, which direction the string wants to come back in. But you can influence it by moving the string line, taking some off one edge of a limb and doing all sorts of things. But say I decide, well, that's where the string wants to sit and the bow wants to pull back at this angle, I can shape the grip to suit. Remove this edge of the grip and end up with it centralised. At the moment I think the bow wants to sit slightly like that. But when I get it on the tiller I can examine that in more detail, and I'll try and explain what I mean. But it's one of those things, you could just slap a string on it and pull and let the bow decide what it wants to do. And I've seen a heavy English yew longbow that was like that, and the bow didn't want to pull back with its sapwood on the back of the bow. It ended up twisting sideways, so the sapwood was sort of pointing off at 45 degrees, so it was almost pulling back sideways. It didn't look very nice, but that's one advantage with the flat bow. It's much more stable a longbow can twist sideways at the drop of a hat, which is why you tend to make them a bit wider than you need to start with, and narrow them at the last minute when it's all coming back nicely. I've still got plenty of width here. This is well over 2 inches wide here, so I could narrow it all from this side and say, look, the string line is in the middle. I haven't actually got a problem yet, but it's a matter of just trying to keep on top of it and watch what's happening. Right, just to try and illustrate a bit more, here's the 2 arrow trick. So you hold an arrow onto the limb just using an elastic band, and that's showing you how the limbs are twisted relative to each other. But of course that's at just one point on the limb, and here I've chosen that big dip. If I move it perhaps back along to a less severe point of the limb, that's not quite so bad, is it? That gives you an idea. But this limb is much more consistent. It's generally sloping that way. There we can see they're very similar there. Perhaps I'm indulging in overthink with all this string line stuff, but there's more than one way to skin a cat. What I've done is I've relieved the grip this side a bit to marry it up better to the string line, but also nearer the finished final width. So I had plenty of room to do that. And if the limb was bending over to one side, it always moves towards the weaker side. So I've eased off along what would have been the stiffer side. Another nice thing is you'll see I've got it onto a low brace now. It's about sort of 4 inches. So here we are on the tiller at a low brace. Don't worry about the bow tilting. It's only because I'm pulling it that side of the centre line, because that's how it will be pulled in use. That's looking pretty good. What we've got is this sort of weird bit here, which it throws your eye and it looks a bit stiff, because if you imagine if a bow's flat it will bend easily, but if it's that way it won't want to bend, and if it's at 45 degrees it will try and go that way. It's all a bit weird. So that's the sort of elephant in the room, if you like. I think the left limb's bending lovely. It's just that right limb's a bit peculiar. That's 45. Yeah, I think the right is 50 at about 20. It's sort of this whole area, which is where all that character is. In fact, I can feel it sort of thick there. That needs looking at. Yeah, there's a lot going on in this area with all these sort of undulations and thick patches. That was where I'd put the L for leave, but I don't think it's a weak point now. But I think it's sort of this section that needs to move a little bit more. Well, there's a crack in the cambium there. I think we're stiff at that knot, and this area where it does that is very problematic. Tiller's looking pretty good now, so I'm spending more time cleaning up the back. Just having a bit of a go with the scraper. I had to sharpen it, but I'm sure that's covered elsewhere on YouTube. But I'm beginning to get some nice attractive sort of figure where these undulations were, and where I've had to remove some of the ridges off the sapwood to stop it being too stiff. I think it's going to look quite pretty. Nearly all the cambium's popped off. Get a bit more on this lower limb to pick off, but that doesn't take a lot. Get me putty knife under there, that will flick off. But yeah, this undulating upper limb's gonna look nice. It's hard to avoid having thick points. you know, in between the undulations where there's effectively a ridge. I can feel it with my fingers. But you see there, I've tried to follow the curve of the wood. Where it's popped out a bit, or I've scraped it out, or it's just very interesting. It'll be a nice character bow. Still looks slightly asymmetric, and there's certainly a bit of twist in it. I'm getting slightly nervy now about this area, but this outer third or outer half of this limb was looking stiff, so I've had the verniers on it trying to, you know, make sure it's getting thinner all the way along, and also trying to remove some of the ridges. I mean, it's sort of fairly self-evident that if that's the cross-section of your limb, then most of the stress is going to be concentrated on that ridge. So where that's excess sapwood, I've tried to take it down a bit, or relieve the underside as well. Just trying to keep it fairly even thickness. For those who worry about the bow tilting at an angle, as I pull it, it straightens up. And some of that imbalance is due to the weight of that ring. So anyway, we're sort of getting towards the nearer the finishing of it now. Is that right limb coming round a bit? I think it is. Yeah, I mean, it just looks a bit nervy. There was a lot of talk about tiller shape on one of the Facebook posts, talking about elliptical tiller versus circular tiller and so on and so forth. Theoretically, a slightly elliptical tiller is better, but how slightly is slightly? No one defines how elliptical is elliptical, and if you make it too elliptical, then you know, your ends, your whip tillered, the tips are doing all the work. Also, on this sort of bow with a stiff grip, you're almost looking at the curve of the two limbs relative to each other, as well as the overall shape. I might put something up showing, you know, a curve fitting to a bow to see how it looks. But the point about a circular tiller is it's much easier for a beginner to judge. You can get a plate or a mug or something and hold it up in front of an image of the bow or in front of the bow, and you can judge the curve of it. Whereas an ellipse, well, how much elliptical? Or you might even have the ellipse going the wrong way. But that's one of the hard things when you're a beginner, it's getting your eye in to see the shape of that bow. And anything that helps you do that is useful. Just out of interest, here's something circular. You can get an idea. 25-inch draw. So we're getting pretty close. I can take a still of that, I can put it on the computer, I can use paint to draw ellipses on each limb or the whole bow or what have you, and I can fiddle around. I don't necessarily need it because I've got a fair amount of experience, but a guy posted a longbow the other day. I've made this longbow and it shoots, and I said, that's great. To make any bow, I think it's £45, to make any £45 bow that shoots is an achievement. And he knew it wasn't perfect, but by drawing a circle you could see he had much too much bend in the middle, and the outer third of one limb was stiff. But by looking at it, you know, he'll learn, it'll get better. But he made a bow and it shot, which is more than a lot of armchair experts do.